one of the things we're going to do with the new website is there's a place for videos. So we're going to put the Sunday messages on our website. Am I allowed to go now? Yes? Okay. So I want to speak on honoring all people this week. And I want to begin with a quote from Ernest Holmes, who founded the Centers for Spiritual Living. And he wrote, "Love is within us. It cannot be destroyed. It can be ignored. To the extent that we abandon love, we will feel it has abandoned us. Denying love is our only problem, and embracing it is the only answer. Through the power of love, we can let go of past history and begin again. Love heals, love forgives, and love makes whole." So I read, years ago when we had the bombing in Oklahoma City, after it was over, social scientists went and they spoke to the survivors, and they said, what is it that helped you get through? What is it that gave you comfort? And what they said that gave them comfort and enabled them to go through was the actions of people inside and outside the community. They said, all racial bias seemed to disappear, and language differences moved away, and people only spoke to one another in the language of love. And everyday people became heroes. And somebody said, we all bleed red. We all cry salty tears. We all have hearts that break in despair. And what got them through is people recognized that, and people came to them with love and honoring and caring. Piero Ferrucci said that a sense of belonging is basic to all humanity, and we can ask the question, what am I a part of? Ernest Holmes said that when we wish peace for other people, we receive peace. When we reach out in love to other people, we get love back. What we give away in our heart is what comes back to us. So I read a blog this week by a woman who said, suppose you were Catholic and you're in a restaurant and somebody starts to choke. Would you go up to that person, and if they were a Jew or if they were a Muslim, would you not help them? She said, of course you would. And she said, if you came upon an accident and somebody needed assistance, before you gave them assistance, would you ask them what their religion was or what their sexual preference was? She said, no, you wouldn't do that. And she said, part of the reason we wouldn't do that is because subconsciously we all realize that we're one, and that's why we treat people with loving kindness when we see people that need assistance. And she said, what we need to do now is to form our universe again with love and putting aside fear and hate. So, Jenna back there is really, Becky and I really love her. In fact, I always tell Jenna that she's the sister that I never had. But this week, Becky found out a secret that Jenna has been keeping from us all along, and now I'm going to tell you what it is.
Yeah, I'd like to know.
Okay. Before she became a religious science minister, she was a nun. We did not know that. And how do I know that? Because I read an article this week by a lady named Sister Jenna, and there's only one Jenna, right? So it had to be her. So this is what Sister Jenna, I thought, made a great point. She said, I don't remember the year now that she wrote this, but she said in the Istanbul airport, remember there was a massacre in the Istanbul airport, and she said 41 people were killed and 239 people were injured. And she said, I'm writing this as I'm sitting in the Reagan Airport in Washington, D.C. And I'm watching people run by with their heads down. And she said, no wonder nobody saw anything suspicious in Istanbul. She said, because we don't see one another anymore. She said, we have the power now to send a text across the world, but we don't see one another here and now. She said that we are more united now by social media than we ever have been in the history of humanity. But we don't look up at our phones to see one another. You know, and it reminded me, I forgot the restaurant we were in last summer, and it was a gorgeous day, and the restaurant is on the water. And we had a table looking out on the water, but there were tables downstairs on the sand that were really cool. And there was a family sitting down on the sand. Literally, they had tables on the sand. And it was a mother, father, and two teenagers. And they each had their phone and were looking down. They weren't talking to one another, and they weren't looking at this gorgeous scene. And I said to Becky, that should be us down. We should have that table. They don't need a table with a view. And that's what Sister Jenna was saying. You know, she's saying we need to create a world out of love, because the world that we've created so far isn't working really very well. And I saw this quote by Emerson, who said, it is one of the most beautiful compensations of this life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself. So there's a fable, some of you might have heard this before, but there's a fable about somebody who is really curious about what heaven and hell are like. And he keeps asking God to let him know. So God sends an angel to him to show him heaven and to show him hell. And they go together, and they go to hell first. That's a good way to put it, huh? They go to hell first, and what they see in hell, they see this large banquet table full of all kinds of fabulous foods. And the people sitting there across from each other are all emaciated and starving. And they've all got yardsticks attached to their arm from above the elbow and going down past their fingers. So they've got all of this gorgeous food, and they can't get any of it because they've got these sticks attached to them. And then the angel takes them to heaven, and he goes in, and it's the same thing. They've got this huge banquet table full of all this great food, but the people there are happy and joyous, and they've got the same yardsticks attached. The difference is the people in heaven are feeding one another. You know, we need to embrace our diversity. We differ in a lot of different ways, but we all have highs, we all have lows, we all have pain, we all have joy, and that's what really brings us together, because in our diversity, we also are unique, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But Rabbi Harold Kushner says that when people come to him and they say to him, where is God? He said, that's not the right question. The right question to ask is, when is God? When is God? He said, because being in the right place at the right time isn't the place where we meet God. He said, we meet God. God comes into our lives when we act with humanity, when we feed the poor, when we cry out for justice, when we can get beyond our own idea of how important, or our own idea of our own self-importance. He said, God comes into our life when we make room for God in our life. And when we make room for God in our life, we make room for one another. Probably most of you have seen Oprah when she had the old Oprah show. And we used to watch it periodically, and one of my favorite guests on Oprah's show was Robin Smith. Some of you, she's a psychologist. In fact, Robin wrote, I think, one of the best books I have ever read on relationships. And Becky and I actually have done a workshop based on that book. But she also talks about our oneness and being together. And she said, you know, she asked the question, can you open your heart to somebody who thinks differently than you do? And she said it's important to be open and to accept everybody, because when we don't, we miss the opportunity to learn and to grow and to expand our worldview. And she said having relationships is more important to living a good life than being right. And she said, if what's important to you is to be right, you lose out on all kinds of connection in life that can be available to you. So, you know who one of the best-selling authors is today? Rumi. He is still, in fact, I read somewhere that he's still the top-selling author. So I want to read you a couple of short Rumi quotes. One of them, he said, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And another one of his quotes, he said, I think I did this one a couple of weeks ago, I, you, he, she, we, in the garden of mystic lovers, these are not true distinctions. And so what he's saying in both of them is that we're one, and there's no separation. And if we can be willing to move beyond our judgments, we can meet one another in that field. And when we meet, we can still disagree. It doesn't mean, you know, we all have to be Democrats or Republicans or whatever. We can still meet and disagree and treat each other with kindness and compassion. We can disagree, but we can do it with loving kindness, and we can honor our differences. So I had no idea what Becky was going to read today, because she picked it out in the car on the way here after we got the call from Edgar that his mom died. And so the Centers for Spiritual Living has a global vision, and I'm not going to read it all, but I just want to read a couple of sentences of what the Greater Center and we stand for. We see a world in which every person lives in alignment with his or her highest spiritual principle, emphasizing unity with God and connection with each other. A world in which individuality and collectively we are called to a higher state of consciousness and action. We envision humanity awaking to its spiritual magnificence and discovering the creative power of thought. A world where every person discovers his or her own personal power and ability to create an individual life that works within a world that works for everyone. We envision a world in which we live and grow as one global family that respects and honors the interconnectedness of all life. A world where this kinship with all life prospers and connects through the guidance of spiritual wisdom and experience. We envision a world that works for everyone and for all of creation. So this week, I think I've talked about this before, but Becky and I work together, and Becky does almost all of the research for my messages. And she almost never comes to me and says, you have to do this. This week, she came to me and said, I just saw this story, and you have to tell it on Sunday. So I always listen to Becky. It's a story about somebody who's a former white nationalist who now describes himself as an activist against hate. And the background story is, When he was in middle school, he was bullied. And the only people that welcomed him were the white nationalists. And so he became one. And he was really active and spoke and did other things. And after 9/11, he joined the army. And it didn't say where he was, but it had to have been Iraq. And he was in Iraq, and the platoon or squad that he was with was ambushed. And he realized he was gonna die, that he was seconds from being shot. And he said, all of a sudden, a black soldier who knew him and knew exactly what he stood for saved his life. And he said that incident made him start to reevaluate where he was. And the more he thought about it, the more he said, I have to move beyond this hate. And then he fell in love and he got married. And his wife introduced him to a new set of people. And then they had a daughter. And he said, I can't let my daughter grow up with the hate that I grew up with. And so he totally changed. And he said, now what he believes is we're all in this together. It's about human connectedness, and there's no place for hate. What a change. What a change. I just saw something really scary on the internet. I was telling Becky and Ed and I think Jenna this morning. I didn't get to read the whole article, but I saw something by somebody who also was a former white supremacist. And he said, you know, it's gonna get worse because the white supremacists now aren't trying to do each other with mass shootings. They're all trying to outdo Tim McVeigh in what he did in Oklahoma City. So we need to do something to move beyond, as Sister Jenna said, to move beyond the world that we created. So let's talk about labels for a moment. You know, it's so easy to use labels to look at people, it's a very surface thing to do, and you don't have to go really deep, do you? You just have to look, and we put people in a box. So I would ask you, think about how many times in your life somebody labeled you and what it felt like. And when they labeled you, if you felt disrespected, because they only see one piece of you. And it made me think, people really label ministers and have different ideas. So I just want to tell you two quick things. One of Becky and I, when we lived in Southern California, our closest friend was a woman that I met in business way before I was a minister. And then I became a minister, and I did a lot of work with her because her husband was dying, and I helped her get through that. And when a few years later, when she was getting remarried, she had Becky and I fly. She actually paid for us to fly back and to do her wedding, and we actually vacationed together. So we were pretty close. And one day, I think we were having dinner at a restaurant, and she looked at me and she said, wow, I am so glad I met you before you were a minister. And I said, why? And she said, because we'd never be friends. And I said, Kathy, why? And she said, because how I think of a minister, I would have never let myself get to be friends with you, because she has all of this labeling of what a minister is like. And she said, I knew you before, so I knew you weren't like that, so I could risk being friends with you. And we would have all lost out, Becky and me and Kathy and her husband, you know, in a really great relationship, because in her head was the label for minister. And just one other quick thing. A couple of years ago, we were in St. Augustine. Becky and I were doing a workshop in the St. Augustine Church, and we were staying in a Marriott. And so one night before dinner, we went to get a drink, and we were sitting at the bar, and they had these really big square tables. And another couple sat down opposite us at the table, and we were having a really great conversation. And the guy said to me, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a minister." And you can ask Becky later. They stopped talking to us, and they literally turned their chairs, so instead of facing us, they were facing sideways. And we looked at one another. It was like we were living it, but it was really hard to believe. But again, you know, it's a label. It's a label. Rachel Remen wrote, when we label, think about this, when we label, we are in relationship with our expectations and not life itself. So what can we do? What can we, you know, as you know, individuals do? Well, you know, one of the things we could do is we could remember that there are 7.5 billion people in the world, and no two of us are alike. No two of us are alike. And another thing we could do when we meet somebody that's different, we can try to understand their story and how that story made them who they are. And when we meet somebody who's different, we cannot judge on external appearances, whether how they love, who they love, what their religion is, what their color is. We cannot make one thing the thing that stands out about them, that we allow to define them. We can go deeper than that. We can do acts of kindness, small stuff like smiling at people, like holding a door open for somebody. We can practice empathy and not judge people so quickly. All of those just help along the way. You know, there's one other thing, and I didn't talk about it for two reasons. One is there's just so much you could do in 25 minutes or so. And also I did a talk on forgiveness a couple of weeks ago, but I did want to mention it. And I reread something this week that I just want to share. Immaculée Ilibiaza is a woman who grew up in Rwanda. And somehow Wayne Dyer discovered her. And in growing up, she wrote a book that's called Left to Tell. And it's about the Holocaust that happened in Rwanda and what happened to her and what happened to her family. All of her family was wiped out. She was the only one that survived. And I got, she was coming to be our main speaker at our summer conference one year. And I got to pick her up at the airport, which was a 2-hour ride. So we got to spend 2 hours one-on-one. And she's just a fabulous person. And she relates this story in the book. After the Holocaust is over, she goes to the prison that's holding the leader of the gang that killed her mother and her brother. And they bring this guy to her. And she describes him, she said he was totally emaciated and dirty, and he had been, I guess, a good-looking guy. And she said he needs a shave, and he's just totally different. And he can't look at her. He's so embarrassed about who he became and what he did. He can't look at her. So when they bring him, he gets on his knees, and he just looks down. And Immaculée reaches over, and she takes his hand, and she says to him, "I forgive you." The warden goes ballistic, and he said, "What do you mean you forgive him? I brought him here so you could question him. I brought him here so you could spit on him." And he said to her, "And you forgive him? How could you do that? Why did you do that?" And she just looked at the warden and she said, "Forgiveness is all I have to offer." And I thought when I read that again this week, that for so many of us, forgiveness is all we have to offer. And maybe at some points in our life, forgiveness is all we need to receive too. So I want to close with a quote from Pablo Casals. And the title of this is called You Are a Marvel. And he wrote, each second we live is a new and unique moment of the universe, a moment that will never be again. And what do we teach our children? We teach them that 2 and 2 is 4, and the capital of France is Paris. Will we also teach them what they are? We should say to each of them, do you know what you are? You are a marvel. You are unique. In all the years that have passed, there has never been another child like you. Your legs, your arms, your clever fingers, the way you move. You may become a Shakespeare, a Michelangelo, a Beethoven. You have the capacity for anything. Yes, you are a marvel. And when you grow up, can you then harm another who is like that, who is like you, a marvel? You must work. We all must work to make the world worthy of our children. God bless you. Thank you for being here, and have a great week.